Hello, everybody. We're still talking about shipping, but we're zooming in to talk about green corridors. We'll explain exactly what those are in a moment, but first I just want to introduce the panel. We have Claudio Abate, who's the VP for Policy and Government Affairs at MSC Group, it's the world's largest shipping company. We've got Elisa Cranes, who's the head of ports and shipping at C40 Cities. It's a network of cities working, and their mayors working against climate change around the world. And we have Edvard Molitor, who runs public affairs and sustainability at the Port of Gothenburg. Welcome, Edvard. And with us remotely, thank you very much for joining us, is Lau Wai-ji. He is the Director of Partnerships at the Global Center for Maritime Decarbonization in Singapore. Hello. I thought we would start just by explaining to the audience what exactly a green corridor is. Obviously, you know, maybe the best person to start, I don't know, but you know, we're going to move down the definition chain once we go. So Edvard, you're next to me, so why don't you give us your understanding of a green corridor?
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for that question. It's a very difficult question, believe it or not, because there are very many different definitions of green corridors. The simplest version is that it's basically a distance from port to port, which is to be decarbonized efficiently, and first movers to be incentivized on that corridor. Then exactly how you do it can be described in many different ways.
Okay. Elisa, you were a convener. What does it mean to you?
Well, I'd actually like to build on Elizabeth's point that she made earlier. She made this really great analogy to shipping decarbonization being this big elephant. And in order for us to really move it forward, we have to take it in manageable pieces. And that's what, in my view, that's what green shipping corridors allow us to do. I actually had to explain a green shipping corridor to an 8-year-old very recently, so there's a simple explanation I came up with. A green shipping corridor is a special trade lane on which partners have to combine resources to deploy low and zero carbon technologies and solutions. And without having these special trade lanes, we won't be able to fight climate change. So they're really important.
I cannot but agree with Elizabeth this description. And for us, I would like to add that for us is green corridors might be a good way for contributing to the start in the decarbonization pathway.
It does seem from the previous panel as though there's a kind of chicken and egg problem or first mover almost disadvantage to some extent. Lau Wai-ji, I believe there's some green corridor plans in and out of Singapore. Tell us about your view from your side of the world.
Hi. Hello everyone. So from our perspective, this can be used as a green corridor, especially around that allows or have the supply of green fuel across the ports. So one of the initiatives we're doing is really the one we call the Port in Singapore. So it covers both the supply on both ends, and it's by this now taking up renewable energy. And there was something that can be done in 2 years.
Okay. And so the reason we need them, the agreement seems to be, is that it's difficult for anyone to go first. Is that about right? What are the challenges to going first? Is it the just extra cost of capital because you're trying to do something unproven? Is it just uncertainty in general, difficulty getting things past boards? What's your experience with that, Edvard, from the port perspective?
I would say that the difficulty is that we're actually about to deploy very new types of fuels. So we need a totally new infrastructure in place. And that's going to cost a lot of money. So it comes down to the money in the end. We need the infrastructure, but we also need the regulations and the knowledge on how to handle these new fuels, because they come with new risks and new ways of handling. So it's a lot to be put in place, and therefore it is a bit of a chicken and egg, even though that we don't really like that term in shipping anymore, because we had that discussion with LNG a few years back.
It crops up everywhere, let me tell you, as a journalist. Chickens and eggs are everywhere.
Exactly. So now we say that we have the chickens, we have the eggs. It's the cost gap which is the problem, because it's more expensive to deploy these new fuels. That's the main issue.
Elisa, you seem to have a view kind of across this piece. Can you tell us about some of the green corridors that you are most interested in at the moment, and what the specific things that they are doing are to try and kickstart this?
Yeah, so our role as a convener of corridor partnerships has been an interesting one, because we end up incubating these green shipping corridor partnerships, which are all new. It's a new space. It's a new space for all of us, but it's also a new space where actors from public and private sector that have never done work together in the past now have to come together and collaborate. And not just collaborate, they have to share risks, they have to share goals, they have to establish joint commitments, and frankly put action behind these commitments, right? Because the essence of green corridors is that we are moving from ambition to action. We're starting to demonstrate the climate ambition and goals for decarbonization in very specific chunks of work. And so in our experience, it's been really interesting to see how ports, governments, shipping lines, cargo owners are all coming together and starting to collaborate on a lot of these really complex issues. And I think, as far as the different green shipping corridors out there, and I'm really glad we have a good number of corridor partnerships represented today that can speak about their perspectives and their challenges and opportunities that they see in the space. But I think even though all of the different green corridors in the world right now are working on different things, some of them are moving passengers, some of them are moving containers, others are moving iron ore, the ingredients for a green corridor to be successful are the same. We have to have customer demand, we have to have policy and regulation, we have to have viable fuel pathways, and we also have to have cross-value chain collaboration. And so I think this last component is really very key in order to get green shipping corridors operationalized, because you can have the willing stakeholders, but if they can't work together, then nothing happens. So in our experience, this has been a really, true realization that this is cross-value chain collaboration in practice.
And at the risk of revealing my own ignorance here, is one of the recent drivers of this the COP agreement on this in Scotland last autumn? Is that I mean, you guys probably know this better than I do. Is that a big part of it, or has this been in motion long before that?
Well,
you could actually say that it's been in motion for a very long time. Actually, when Green Corridors was presented at COP26, a colleague of mine found it interesting to go over to the cupboard in the other end of our office. He pulled out this poster, rolled it up, and said, look, it's dusty, but it says Green Corridors. It's from 2008. So it's been around for a while. We've been discussing this for a long time, but it hasn't really happened anything. So it comes back to what Elisa mentioned there. We need to see action. We need to see the actual action coming into place. But the concept as such, it has been around. What happened in COP26 was that a number of countries actually promised and signed that they would provide incentives, not necessarily financial incentives, but some sort of incentives to help these to be established. That's the key factor.
We talked in the last panel, or well, we actually didn't get to talk as much as I'd like about the speed of transition and how important that is given decarbonization goals, and now we have these pledges from countries in COP. Claudia, what are the big challenges for you guys in doing this quickly? Like, what are the things that, there are various things that you guys need to do, and there are various external factors. What are the biggest ones in your way?
Well, if you, I don't know if you're referring to green corridor specifically or in general to decarbonization. Decarbonization, we have a long list of challenges, very, very, very difficult to face. I would like to mention the technology, so new ships or new technology to be put on board, so costs. The crew training, that is sometimes is disregarded, but we need to address also the training of the crew, because they have to manage new fuels, new realities, let me say. That is probably, from our side, the easiest part of the story. Then the most complicated parts are the supply chain. So meaning that talking about alternative fuels, we probably do not consider properly the fact that we are talking about fuels that might be green or not, or fully green, partly green. So we needed to secure our supply chain. And the securing the supply chain means also to have the places where we can find it, not only the supplier that can supply us the fuel, but the place where we can have the fuel available. So, and everything starts from the choose of the type of fuel, of course. So we have so many challenges in these days. And the supply chain and the infrastructure. think about the infrastructure we needed that, because if we switch from methanol or ammonia, so if we use a biofuel, it's a little bit easier again to be used and to be stored, to be found. And if we switch to ammonia or green methanol, the issues are different, really.
Okay. Lau Wai, thank you for waiting patiently on the other end of the line. From the Singaporean perspective, Singapore's port is huge. It's a very important node in the global shipping network. Is Singapore involved in any of these green corridors? I mean, I imagine they could have green corridors going to, a large number of places. Can you tell us about ones that are either already starting work or about to start work?
Right. So one that has already started last year in August is the one between Singapore and the Port of Rotterdam. So that is the Green and Digital Corridor. So that one, TCMP is an action partner. So what we are doing is really to develop and identify the ambition level, look at what fuels will be available here, and also get these ship owners to be committed to the Green Corridor in terms of deploying ships that are compatible, for example, ammonia, methanol, or even biofuel for that matter. So this is ongoing. We expect certain results to be ready during the next maritime week as well.
I didn't catch the other end. Singapore and
Rotterdam.
Rotterdam. And what you said there was that it's important that you have the same fuel setup on either end. So even if you narrow it down to 2 ports, you still have a smaller but still a coordination problem, in the sense that if you're going to refit all of the ships to burn one thing, then it has to be on both ends of the chain, right? Okay. So does that mean that presumably there's quite a lot more back and forth between the operational teams of Singapore's port and Rotterdam's port at the moment because of this?
Oh yes. We're meeting almost every 2 weeks. Yeah. Really to set out the ambition, understand how to move this forward. And I guess it takes a lot of effort to really start harmonize certain things. Just how we also talk about biofuels. ISO 8170 is there, but it doesn't really cover the specifications for biofuels. So even that needs to be harmonized in order for us to understand, what sort of requirements we're looking at when the shippers are asking for new fuels.
Yeah, and I mean, the scale of the challenge is important to remember. I think I saw numbers today looking at aviation, and shipping uses a little bit less energy, but it's about, for the British shipping, the British grid can just about supply enough electricity to decarbonize aviation, but that's just one grid to do one sector. So if we're talking about shipping and the global grid, we're talking about an enormous amount of energy and an enormous amount of investment. So obviously, the electricity grid is just one place where you guys don't have full control over what happens. Edvard, at your port, involved in any of these projects? Where are you thinking of linking to, already linked up to? Do you have the same bi-weekly schedule?
More or less, yes. We have a number of corridors. We have chosen to do this as a stepwise approach. So we started out by establishing a corridor with Ghent in Belgium, where we have a ro-ro line going back and forth. So we have 2 ports which are fairly far developed when it comes to sustainability, and we can rather quickly put something in place. We have a ship owner which is interested. So that was easily set up because it's a short distance. From there, we then move on to establish the next green corridor to Rotterdam, which is more about short sea container shipping, tanker segment. And then from there on, we're going to be looking at some more deep sea connections further away. Because with the little ones, it's easier to get something in place. You get the infrastructure in place, you get the regulations in place. It took a long time to get bunkering regulations for methanol, for instance, in place. We're now doing it for ammonia. It's going to take even longer because it's a lot more risks involved with that. But then our hope is, of course, to establish something, perhaps Singapore, perhaps Shanghai, further away. And of course, when we talk to Rotterdam guys every couple of weeks, we talk about the Singapore corridor as well. So we're trying to connect those two as well. So there is green corridors in, I would say, almost every port.
I want to come back to some of that, but Alyssa, is there a kind of tipping effect maybe here? Because we just heard Edvard say that he'd like to do one with Shanghai eventually. We know Shanghai's already doing one with various other places. So if it turns out that you all have both installed the same fuel things and you've done the same regulatory work, it's going to be easier, right? So is there a tipping point to this where lots of different ports have made bilateral connections and you can start to connect those into multilateral connections?
Well, that's what we're trying to get to, and I think we're starting to realize this with the two corridors that we're convening. One of them is Los Angeles, Shanghai, which happened pre-Clyde Bank. So going back to how Green Corridor started, this was a pre-COP26 corridor. Didn't get announced until later on, but it has been a partnership in development for some time now. And now the recently announced Los Angeles, Long Beach, Singapore corridor, which was launched at COP27, and that's going to, I think, take some of the same trends that were just mentioned in relation to the Singapore-Rotterdam corridor being a green and digital corridor. So back to the question, though, what we're learning from managing these two corridor partnerships is that there's definitely a tipping point, and we have to very quickly figure out how we communicate globally about these different green corridor initiatives, because we have to find a common language. We have to work on establishing common standards. And even though we're all working on probably multiple pathways to zero and multiple technologies, and some ports prioritize electrification versus green fuels and other things, we still have to work in concert. And if we don't do that, it would be very, very difficult for us to decarbonize. So one thing that I guess we should start thinking about is it shouldn't be about your green corridor versus my green corridor. It should be a network of corridors that are getting really good at coordinating and cross-collaborating with each other.
Claudio, you guys are a heavyweight here. You're the biggest shipping company in the world. Are you able to use your muscle to kind of incentivize ports and the various people that you connect with to start doing some of these things?
Well, it's a difficult question because we do not use, normally we don't use muscles in our relationships.
Not literal muscle.
Use our needs. I mean, we try to convey our needs to our partners, let me say, in our business. But we have in front of us a real big question mark. That is the type of fuel we are talking about again. So we need to, we like this type of approach that is wider, because we need to have the possibility to play and to see which is the best technology and relevant fuel that we may adopt depending on the trades also. So we are open. And I liked very much, if I may, what has been said by Lisa. I don't want to flatter her too much today, but she said a very important point that I had in mind when we discussed about green corridors, and the network of green corridors. Because in reality, I believe that the final goal is not to have a single or a double ports dialoguing between themselves. We need to have a real network. Because coming back to the muscles, if I think about MSC, we serve in something like 165 countries. So we are glad, and we are participating to a couple of green corridors. We of course, we provide our expertise, our effort, our support to the initiatives, but we need to see the discussion in a wider way, because we cannot concentrate on two ports only, and this got the word.
What you're saying makes me think that I wonder if there is a upside to having a diversity of approaches in different green corridors. So one green corridor does methanol, one green corridor does ammonia, and if you're using a bunch of different ones that all do it in different ways, you're going to be able to gather data about what works well for you overall and for the industry. Is that kind of the way you would like it to go?
Well, today, our approach is that we are very flexible. We need the flexibility. So we need an approach that may see in our fleet ships running on different fuels, dual fuel, trial fuels, depending on the situation. So we are very open to that. So we are not saying that specifically we need one fuel, and one fuel is the solution, because probably is not. Because depending on the reality, depending also, again, I don't want to stress the point, but I need to underline the supply chain and the fact that we, at the end of the day, we will need green fuels. So that is the driving forces for us.
Yeah. And in a way, I hope that this will be a question for you. Is obviously all the ships in Claudio's fleet need engines, and they need a whole bunch of infrastructure that go around the engines. Are we going to see engine providers like MAN building one engine that can burn 3 different fuels, or how is that going to work? I mean, I doubt you can put 3 engines in one ship.
Okay, so I must declare I'm not an engine expert, but at least from our interactions and we've been tracking NAN's development as well, we know that dual fuel engines are coming to be quite common. We have tanks, and people have ordered tanks that are ammonia ready, super fuel ready. So I guess this is where there is sort of flexibility. So not that you're installing 3 engines to run 3 different fuels, but rather one engine can run 3 different fuels. So I think this would be the trend in order to give the kind of flexibility that NNC is looking for. Okay,
so that is happening. Does that, I mean, I asked the last ports guy this, but does this kind of tri-fuel dilemma make it harder to run your port? If you've got some people saying I want this fuel, some people saying I want that fuel, presumably it all depends on the wholesale market, like maybe one day somebody wants to burn this and another day something else. Doesn't that create a lot of complexity for you guys in terms of just the bandwidth to get all of those fuels, all those different kinds to the ships?
Yeah, definitely. You're perfectly right. And just like Raul, my dear friend from Valencia, said, it's a difficulty. We work together on this just for that reason. We try to find a way to become what's called nowadays a green hub, which means a port that can actually supply all the different fuels. But all the different fuels means different types of risks. They cannot always be stored together. So there's a lot of analysis that needs to be made before we can actually supply them. Although, one should also remember that not every port has to supply every type of fuel. Because you can also have one port supplying the fuel, and then 3 ports on the way where you only come with your vessel, but you do not actually bunker. The problem, though, is that with some of the new fuels like ammonia, you need to know the risk, even if the vessel is not bunkering in your port. Previously, we didn't have to care as a port. If a vessel came to our port without bunkering, whatever fuel they had on board was not of interest to us, because it did not pose a risk. With ammonia, the fuel on board can pose a risk for the port. So every port that vessel visits needs to know about the risk, which means we come back to the training issue. There's a lot of personnel that needs to be trained in this. It's going to be a huge work.
What is that risk for a ship that's burning ammonia that is just
If there's a
stopped?
small leak, you can feel it right away, which means potential panic, which is a problem because you can feel it before it's dangerous. On the other hand, that's a safety issue, so it's good that you can feel the smell before you can actually get hurt by it. But then, of course, ammonia, if you get a leak in a port, is more toxic and poisonous to people than oil is.
And I've been to ports. There are, the water in the port is somewhat oily. It's not unheard of to have small leaks, right? So
it happens, unfortunately.
Yeah. The other thing that you talked about that I imagine is a big challenge is just we're talking about how can we go faster and what are the challenges, but you've got to do 3 separate regulatory pipelines for each fuel that you want to bunker, right? I mean, is there? I've just finished doing a big project writing about the electricity grid, and there's all kinds of talk about how to make the consenting processes faster but maintain the safety standards. It's a difficult thing to do. How are you approaching that? What kinds of discussions are you having with your regulators about that?
Basically, what we're doing is cooperating with other ports. So there's a lot of different projects going on together with Gothenburg, Valencia, and others, where we try to help each other. So that we try to learn from each other. It's the same thing when you bunker new fuels as when you have to connect to electricity grid for onshore power supply. There's a lot of different types of plugs and techniques and everything.
I'm loving this
cooperation is key here.
I'm loving this family of port managers thing that's emerging. It sounds really fun. Alyssa, you talked about standards. Obviously, that's kind of where this is all going. Are there forums? I mean, I guess this is one of them, but are there forums that are more focused on the standards issue, where you guys all come together to try and figure out, the one true way of doing this? It sounds like you're a ways away from that yet.
Well, we actually have our own forum at C40 called the Green Ports Forum, which is designed to have cities and ports come together to have a dialogue together on these very issues. So there are different working groups within that forum that allow for this exchange of best practice, collaboration, peer-to-peer, knowledge exchange. So that is one mechanism that we actually just launched a green shipping corridors working group, which is global, and it operates across different time zones, and we're just getting started, so I can't say much more beyond that. We're really excited to finally have this global collaboration in play, but in terms of standards, kind of going back to what Edward said and what Claudio said earlier, I think what we are learning also from working with ports and the shipping lines is that they do want the flexibility. So the Los Angeles-Shanghai Green Shipping Corridor, for example, is fuel agnostic. We have 4 large container lines as partners on this corridor, and they're all pursuing different pathways to decarbonize. And they all invested in very different fuels and very different technologies. And the thinking of allowing for that flexibility is that it doesn't limit us to one solution. It certainly does run a risk of having to deal with permitting future fuels that may not necessarily provide the long-term solution, but that's something that the industry has to solve for together.
Yeah. Now might be a good time to just say, if anyone has any questions, please throw your hand up and I will come to you. We'll keep going in the meantime, but we've got just about 10 minutes left. So yeah, why not? This chap in the front here.
Hi, it's a really interesting discussion. I'm Josh Palfram and I advise the World Bank, and I do a lot of projects independently on port waste management plans and recycling plans. So I don't want to change the focus. It's really interesting learning about fuels. But I like what you mentioned about muscle, and if you're a corporate with quite deep pockets operating in a well-regulated environment like ports, how can you be more creative about, tackling this ocean plastics problem, considering you're one of the kind of the main vehicles that could do this? I mean, you certainly have the resources. You have some of the brightest people working for you. What ways have you kind of gone beyond the curve and beyond regulation to try and kind of fix this solid waste management and even wastewater problem that we heard about with the leaks, for example, in port areas? I suppose it's a question for MCS, but also for C40, whether that topic comes up at all. Thank you.
I think.
Claudio, you want to speak to that one?
Honestly, I didn't get your question. Sorry.
No, I'll try again. So I'm working in the solid waste management and the recycling space. There's a lot of kind of port solid waste management plans, or there's a lot of kind of waste that ships produce, for example, that then get dumped into the ports. I work primarily in East Africa and Southern African ports, and usually it's just thrown into an incinerator or it ends up in an uncontrolled dump site. Not saying that this is your responsibility or even kind of a legal mandate, but MCS has and other shipping lines have a very unique opportunity, being highly competent, highly profitable companies, to establish a new precedent, to innovate in the space of solid waste management and recycling in respective ports. So I imagine you've done something. I mean,
sorry, for that reason I didn't get your point. Because I was focusing, my brain was focused on green corridors, and I was not catching your point. Yes, we of course we are obliged. We follow the port request regarding and the country we call the port, or which we call the port, request regarding the waste management. So I cannot say much more about that. I mean, you are suggesting us to promote some new activities on the waste management, but we can take it just because we are talking about green corners now. So we can discuss it later, but this is a little bit out of the discussion of this panel, I guess.
Lisa, did you have a more zoomed out thought at all on that? I mean, maybe one way of thinking about it is, is there an opportunity for the green corridors to be about more than that, or do you feel like it actually makes sense to just optimize for one thing? This comes up a lot in broader environmental
Right.
discussions, right? Do you just zoom in on carbon emission reduction, or do you try and have a more holistic approach?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
No, that's a really good point. So green corridors definitely have a much bigger effect than just decarbonizing maritime shipping. In fact, we didn't even really talk about land side of things, where a lot of the infrastructure investments need to happen for bunkering new fuels, for electrification, and what sort of ripple effect that has on broader supply chains. Because if you think about supply chains, they stretch over land, they stretch over air. The path of shipping a container box from point A to point B involves other modes of transportation. So decarbonizing, having a green corridor oversea should have an effect on other sectors. And so I think that's a really good point you raise, Hal, because one thing we didn't talk about is air quality. And what we do on land side by electrifying port terminals and port operations is we are reducing not just greenhouse gas emissions, but also air pollutant emissions. And air quality is a big issue for ports and port communities and the industry that's involved in moving goods. So I think some numbers are 265,000 deaths were attributed to port shipping emissions in 2020. That's a significant number. And so by being able
It's
to
an
address...
understatement.
I mean, it's a significant number.
Yeah.
And on average, so 2020 was a very high volume year for shipping, but I think so that number is probably lower. I think the average number is 60,000 annually. That's what WHO number says, but it's a significant number. So by being able to address the emissions from land side of things in port operations also has significant, co-benefits to the air quality and public health.
And just so I'm clear, and anyone with a question, throw your hand up. I'll come to you after this. Yeah, this gent here, if the mic could go to him. But so port operations are currently run on what, diesel gens? They're not electrified? This is news to me to some extent. I would have assumed. Were you talking about the cranes and these things? These are mostly diesel, kind of like oil platforms in the same way that their scope 1 is all mostly diesel. Is that right?
Edward, do you want to?
Depends on where you go. I would say in our case, the cranes are electrified. The equipment otherwise is generally in Gothenburg on HBO, so it's biofuel at least,
Okay.
but it's still not electrified to the full extent
Okay.
because it's not available on the shelf yet.
Okay.
There are pilot projects and there's specific ones you can buy, but they're still very expensive.
And we heard in the last panel about electrification of ships at berth. Is that so that they can have power without running their engines in berth? Is that right? Okay, so there's and that obviously is an air quality issue in terms of the local environment. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, yes.
My question is a bit outside of this.
That's okay, but who are you? Tell us who you are first.
Oh, sorry. My name is Augusto Correia. I'm a professor at the university here in Lisbon on maritime logistics.
Thank you for having us.
So it's more a provocation than just a question. It's about what about green corridors for cruise ships? Because here Lisbon receives, for instance, the other day there were 3 huge cruise ships launching a lot of pollution into the air just for working. Of course, electrification would be very nice, but still, I wonder how much does this represent? It's not as much as goods shipping, but it's still a lot.
I think that's a relevant question. Claudio, I think MSC has a cruise ships division.
We have few. And by the way, working for the group, I'm entitled to reply. So yes.
And so green corridors for cruise ships as well. I imagine that cruise ships are a much smaller portion of the carbon emissions pie than cargo. I'm not sure, but I guess I don't. Are there reasons why it's hard to include cruise ships in this conversation?
No, the green corridors are more. I mean, the discussion, of course, can be relevant for cruise ships too, but at the end, the green corridor concept is developed for cargo ships on long and medium range of operations. But I want to reply regarding the if I understood correctly, sorry, the pollution in port. And, well, as far as I know, all our new passenger vessels are fitted with onshore power supply. So if the port, so I would revert to the problem. If the port is capable of providing us the energy, we are ready to take the energy from the port. So we will not use the auxiliary engines. So that is it must be very clear. So it's not a problem of the ship. It's also for the cargo ships. I would say that MSC has probably one of the larger number of ships fitted with a shore power supply. If there is the energy available from ashore, we will use it. So that is not a problem for us.
So there must be some big plugs.
We have a big plugs, but we have big plugs. The problem is that if you go on shore, or you ask for an energy of up to 11, 12 megawatt for a passenger vessel, you need to have the capability ashore for producing green energy, by the way, because otherwise, if you produce it with the coal, using coal, it's the end of the game. I mean.
Still better to electrify if it gets rid of the local air pollution, I guess, right? But it sounds like cruise ships, to some extent, can be part of this. If you've got the electrification infrastructure, then everyone is benefiting, right? Yeah. Does this, like, from the port perspective, is there a difference between plugging in a cruise ship or plugging in a cargo ship, or are you agnostic?
Well, it's a size difference.
Yeah.
So plugging in a ferry is a fifth of the power needed, which means if you plug in one of the big guys, you might shut down 3 blocks at the same time. So it is a problem of electricity demand, of course, and there's a lot of different parts of society that wants to electrify at the moment. So, of course, the efficiency of the electricity is a problem. That said, of course, we try to provide plug-in possibilities for all vessels, and there are a couple of cases, actually, where cruise vessels as well are trying to build green corridors as well.
Okay, interesting.
So it's ongoing.
Any other questions out there for me? We've got this lady in the middle. If the mic could go to her, that would be great. In the meantime, La Wei, I'll just quickly come to you. How does electrification look in Singapore?
Right. So a bit of context. Singapore is natural resource stars. So about 90% of our electricity actually comes from LNG. So if you look at it from the perspective, right, you might as well be better off burning LNG in that sense. So you don't really lose out on the efficiency losses across the electricity generation and power transmission part. So I would say electricity will play a very big role now. And I guess up to the point where we get green electrons into the grid. Otherwise, perhaps alternative fuels will actually be more suitable in this part of the region.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. If anyone has any final questions, do put your hand up. I know we're coming to you, but this will either be our last or second last. So any last questions, do get them in there. Yes, please.
Hello. I'm Noelia Ortega. I'm the director of CTN, the Marine Technology Center that is located in Cartagena in Spain. My question is related to one pressure that is linked to the engines and it's also linked to the carbonization, and it's related to the underwater noise produced by the engines and by. So while you are dealing with the carbonization and you are talking about electrification project, are you taking into account the effects that can have in this emission that is the underwater noise emission? Are you considering this also? Because there are strong links and synergies, and in most cases, electrical propulsion has lower emissions in terms of level of underwater noise.
Gotcha. Let me quickly rephrase what I think the question is, which is there an opportunity in the transition to all of these other fuels? Is there anything about them that helps us make their combustion in the ship quieter, essentially? I mean, we don't have an engine expert here. At least I wonder if you have a global view on this.
Well, the problem of noise probably is more related to the propeller rather than the engine. So, well, there are ongoing researches on that, and we are applied some devices to reduce the noise on some ships, not all the fleet, but now it's mixing the things, noise and emissions are a little bit confusing, you know, in the discussion. So we need to have more discussion. I agree. I will not deny that the noise is a matter that will come, and we will take into consideration in the next future the reduction. But again, we have to live with what we have in the presence now. That is the 7 or 80,000 ships on the water with their propeller as they are built. So we cannot change the world in one day.
Thanks, Claudio. Alyssa, I might give you the last word, which is just something along the lines of what does success look like here? It occurred to me that if you are successful with this, then the concept of a green corridor will be kind of disposed of, right? Because everybody will have just done the right thing and transformed and be decarbonized, and great, no more green corridors. Everything is a green corridor. So what does success look like from your perspective, convening across so many groups as you do?
A fully decarbonized shipping sector by 2050 to align with the Paris Agreement. That would be, I guess, the end goal. I think 2023 is a very important agenda-setting year for green corridors and anybody that works in decarbonizing shipping space, because this summer, IMO will be revisiting their GHG strategy, and I think it is in the hands of those who are practitioners in the space to raise the ambition, to get in front of the national governments who are going to be at the negotiating table at the IMO to make sure that the new strategy is aligned with 1.5 degree Celsius target. And so the last thing I would say, and I see we're out of time, is that cities, which is ports and cities, is one of the tracks of today, and I think that cities have an important role to play here, and they have played a role in both of the corridor partnerships that we have that we've been working on, and I think that they do bring something important to the table and are able to elevate the urgency and the need to the national governments.
Brilliant. Thank you. Well, we are out of time. Thank you very much to all my brilliant panelists, Lawai, Alyssa, Claudio, Edvard. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you for some very interesting questions. Thank you very much.